वीलर्न में आपका स्वागत है. We are discussing marketing research, session 14, cluster analysis and multi-dimensional scaling. Topics covered are inputs for cluster analysis, different approaches to cluster analysis, factors to be considered while using cluster analysis techniques, multi-dimensional scaling, and applications of multi-dimensional scaling. When we say cluster analysis, it is referred to as a technique which is used in order to segment a market. Now, the objective here is basically to find out a group of customers in the marketplace which are homogeneous. When we say homogeneous, that is, they share some common characteristics. The cluster or group which is so found should be large enough so that the company it can develop it profitably. Now, the group of customers that the company hopes to serve, they should be large enough for a company so that it is an economically viable proposition for the company. There could be many ways in which the segments could be created. The segments could be based on the gender, the technology used, the design features of a product, the price of a product. And they could be demographic, and there could be factors such as psychographic. Now what happens, the groupings, they would have to be based on certain other factors also. Now, it is not always possible to segment a market on the basis of one single factor. A combination of factors could also be used to segment the marketplace. When we talk about inputs for cluster, a cluster analysis is basically used for the purpose of segmentation of the market. Now, using cluster analysis technique, one has to go through following procedures on a very broad level. First is, a company identifies its own product capabilities, its financial strength and distribution network. So in a way it answers the questions who I am. Then company, it also identifies the basis on which the customers they need to be clustered. For example, one factor segmentation होना चाहिए या two factor basis of segmentation होना चाहिए, or there could be multi factor basis of segmentation. Now the company or the market research agency, it has to decide which of the attributes they are to be employed that would generate natural grouping in the marketplace. Now the choice of these variables that are to be used to cluster the object, it is one of the most critical decision analysis that is to be made. Now the best way is to select those variables that make sense conceptually. The third is respondents who are part of the research work. They are given the questionnaire to fill it up. Now the questionnaire is typically interval scaled questionnaire. Now the cluster analysis program that is run on the computer, it identifies the different groups or clusters or respondent groups such that the members of any one group are similar to one another, but they are different from the respondents in other group. There are different approaches that are also adopted for cluster analysis. एक extreme approach है where cluster respondents they are in terms of all the information about the respondent, which is basically very thorough, but it may also lead to difficulty in interpretation, and there is a marked differences between the group. Now that is the cluster or the group of respondents that are produced may be a hodgepodge rather than a clearly marked description of the target population. Now another extreme approach, it involves grouping respondents and which is basically on the data that is directly representing the specific consumer requirement. For example, quality or price of a product, this has the advantage of clarity and accuracy, but it is quite limited in describing the target population. There is one approach, cluster analysis, which also depend upon the objective of the study. Supposedly, the objective of the company is physical development of an existing product. Then the consumer needs regarding the product are the most suitable variable for forming the cluster. Now, supposedly an advertisement for a product is to be developed. Then the attitude of the consumer towards the product gains, it becomes more important, as there are groups of people who have positive, negative or even neutral attitudes towards the product. The distance between 2 points is basically an inverse measure of similarity. So the larger the distance between the 2 points, greater are the chances or dissimilarity or differences between the 2 points to happen. और जितना ही distance close होगा, there are chances of more similarity between the 2 points. Also, more the number of respondents which are to be classified into a cluster, more will be the number of distance calculations. Therefore, a large sample size of respondents when we talk, computer or mechanics should be used. Now when we talk about various methods of actually calculating the distance and how to form a cluster, first is the nodal method. In this method, one first selects a point or points that will serve as nodes for forming cluster or the focal point. Now the rest of the points, they are then allocated to each cluster on the basis of their distance from the focal point. Now this method is basically described as first choosing a node and about those objects that have the greatest distance between them, then considering these two objects as focal nodes and allocating all the remaining objects to one cluster or the other based on their distance from the polar nodes. Then splitting the resulting clusters into the same way and continue this process till the collection of points is split into its original members. Another is factor analysis method. So it is another way of developing a cluster, and it is by using a simple method, that is skew factor analysis. Now by this method one will be able to determine which objects logically belong to another and together how are they belonging. Now this is also referred to as inverse factor analysis. Then is linkages method. Now there are three methods in this, in linkages: single linkage, complete linkage method and average linkage method. Now there are factors which are to be considered while using cluster analysis technique. तो जो since there are a number of clusters that may emerge after doing a cluster analysis, but there is a limit to the number of clusters that a company can consider because of two reasons. First, limitation of the market potential within a cluster, and second, there are differences between cluster which are not sharply defined. The second factor which is to be considered is that cluster analysis जो है वो एक सेगमेंटिंग का वे प्रोवाइड करता है टू द मार्केट, जबकि ये जो सेगमेंट्स हैं दीज आर नॉट ट्रीटेड एज एंड दे आर एक्चुअली नॉट अ वाटर टाइट कंपार्टमेंट्स. And the products that are developed for a particular segment, it may also attract people from other segment as well. Thirdly, जो characteristics है cluster का over a period of time they may change. क्योंकि कस्टमर का इकोनॉमिक स्टेटस बढ़ सकता है, there is an improvement in education and lifestyle which happens over a period of time, and this forces the company to have a relook on the marketplace. Then the clusters that have been identified, they are used for further marketing strategies. और वो marketing strategies हो सकती है product development के field में या advertising research के लिए. They could also be used in developing marketing strategies for distribution or for pricing. Now, very important assumption when we discuss cluster analysis वो ये है कि basic measure of similarity on which clustering is based is a valid measure of similarity between two objects. Now, a second major assumption is that there is a theoretical justification and the basis for structuring object into a cluster. Now, as with other multivariate techniques, there should be theory and logic underlying the cluster analysis. Now, the major limitation of cluster analysis is the difficulty in evaluating the quality of the cluster. It is very difficult to know exactly which cluster is similar and which objects are dissimilar. And it is also very difficult to select the clustering criteria. When we talk about multi-dimensional scaling, MDS एक टेक्निक है या फिर एक परसेप्चुअल मैप है और अ पोजिशनिंग मैप इन केस ऑफ अ मल्टीवेरिएट एनालिसिस टेक्निक, एंड दिस इज बेसिकली suitable for measuring human perceptions and their preferences towards a product or a brand. MDS is concerned with spatial representation of relationship among behavioral data. And when we talk about behavioral data that is buyer's perception and preferences. MDS is basically of two types, MDS fundamentals. First is matrix MDS and another is non-matrix MDS. One has to first understand the perception. When we talk about perception, the distances in the mind of the consumer regarding a product or a brand, and plot a geographical representation for the same. Now this task is to work backward. That is, we would have to find out simultaneously the number of dimensions. That can be more than 2-dimension perceptual mapping also. Furthermore, configuration or the pattern of points in that perceptual space, so that their computed interpoint distances, they must be closely matched. Another is application of multi-dimensional scaling. There are typical marketing applications that emerge from multi-dimensional scaling. First is market segmentation. Market segmentation is a technique of trying to identify groups of consumers who exhibit commonality of perception of products and their preferences. Now, one can use MDS technique to identify present perception of products by consumer and use it modify if the company's product or package, so that the product offering of the company moves more and more closer to the ideal requirement of the consumer. Second is advertising evaluation. MDS technique can also be used at the stage of advertising pre-testing में. तो जब एक एडवर्टाइजमेंट डेवलप कर दी जाती है, इट कुड बी टेस्टेड फॉर सिमिलैरिटी और डिसिमिलैरिटी with other advertisement in the same product category. Then is new product development, where a company is interested in repositioning its product or services in the minds of consumer. So the first and the most important activity which is to be done is to assess the current perception of the product in the mind of consumer. Now the classic repositioning case is that of the Cadbury's chocolate, which kept on assessing its positioning platform, and it has successfully moved chocolates from a perceived product as one for children's, and now they are being consumed by a person of any age. Then comes new product development. So MDS technique, it also shows us various perception on different brands, space gaps in the product perception that could also be used to develop new offerings for the target consumer. The last is test marketing. MDS helps to identify cities that have similar demographic characteristics, which to a great extent identifies with a city that could represent a national character. Now, thus it could be understood that MDS is a very useful technique to help in understanding the marketplace and developing strategies for the future. Advantages of MDS, when we say is not the measurement of physical distance, but psychological distances or dissimilarities are calculated. So here we assume that every individual person, they have a mental map of product, and the individual, they keep on evaluating their external environment. The second is, it also assumes that the respondent is able to provide either the numerical measures of his or her perceived degree of similarity and dissimilarity between the objects, or they can also rank pairs of objects. This method could also be used to construct a physical map in one or more dimensional whose interpoint distances are most consistent with the input data. Now, nowadays there are a number of software programs which are also available for conducting MDS analysis. They provide a variety of input data. Some could include MBPREF, MBSCAL-SM, INDSCAL, PREFMNM, Profit and CUST. There are two exercises for you. What is cluster analysis and what are its possible applications? And state how following techniques differ from each other: cluster analysis and discriminant analysis. Thank you and have a nice day. Keep learning and relearning.